fructose, the sweet molecule in sugar, is not glucose. Glucose actually increases mitochondrial function. This was shown by Samir Softic working in Ron Kahn's lab at Joslin Diabetes Center several years ago. Glucose activates two enzymes that increase mitochondrial function. It activates AMP kinase, adenosine monophosphate kinase, which is sort of the fuel gauge on the cell to make more mitochondria, because AMP is a signal to the cell that it's becoming energy depleted and we need to generate more energy, because ATP goes to AMP. So when your ATP goes down, that means you're energy depleted, and then the AMP fits in the active site of the enzyme and induces signals that increase mitochondrial biogenesis. So AMP kinase is the fuel gauge. And it also increases another enzyme called HADH, hydroxyacyl-CoA dehydrogenase, which helps break the fatty acids into two carbon fragments so that they are oxidized. Okay, so glucose, for lack of a better word, is good because it increases mitochondrial function. Fructose, on the other hand, is not. And fructose inhibits three enzymes that are all necessary for adequate mitochondrial functioning, and they're all inhibited. The first enzyme that's inhibited is AMP kinase. And it turns out a metabolite of fructose called methylglyoxal, MGO, binds right in that active site. And because of its methylglyoxal, it's an aldehyde. And that aldehyde moiety binds to arginine in the active site, forms a covalent bond, and therefore it can't be extracted out of that active site. And so basically, it's not just inhibiting that enzyme, it's actually killing that enzyme. It's inactivating that enzyme permanently until a new one is made. Okay? So, number one, you're killing the fuel gauge. Okay? You've just taken a hammer to the fuel gauge. Boom, boom, boom. In addition, it inhibits another enzyme called ACAD-L, acyl-CoA dehydrogenase long chain, which is necessary for those cutting up of the two carbon fragments. And finally, indirectly increased fructose causes an increase in uric acid. This is the work of Rick Johnson at U of Colorado. He's shown that fructose drives uric acid formation. And the reason is because you're taking ATP and going down to ADP and then AMP, then IMP, and then uric acid. And so that uric acid is the endogenous inhibitor of an enzyme in the on the outside of the mitochondria called carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, the CPT1. Now, what is that? That's the enzyme that regenerates carnitine. And carnitine is the shuttle that brings fatty acids from the outside to inside the mitochondria so they can be burned. Okay? The fatty acids don't just show up in the mitochondria. They have to be chaperoned in. They have to be escorted in. And carnitine is the molecule that does it. And every time the carnitine chaperones a fatty acid in for oxidation, it gets phosphorylated. And then it has to be dephosphorylated in order to work again, to recycle it. And uric acid inhibits the enzyme that does that. So everything fructose does to the mitochondria is designed to inhibit its functioning. So when you look at glucose, it's a winner. When you look at fructose, it's a loser. Sugar is both. Which one wins out? Clearly the fructose, because it's killing those enzymes.
You just mentioned something there I wanted to highlight. The fact that sugar, table sugar, sucrose, is both of these together. So you're mentioning the fact that glucose good, fructose bad.
Right.
Oftentimes,
fructose way better than glucose is good.
And the thing, what I'm trying to highlight here is even in nature, things like honey or agave syrup, which, agave is not really that natural, but these things are often found together. So,
well, they're always found together. There's no such thing as fructose without glucose in nature.
Would grains be a starch that would just be glucose, though?
Grains are starches, they're polymerized glucose.
Okay. Meaning, further elaborate on that.
There are two kinds of starches. There's amylose and there's amylopectin. Not the same. Amylose is a string of starches, like, end to end. Okay. It is a string of glucoses bound together by what are known as alpha-1,4 linkages. And in order to break that amylose starch up into glucoses, free glucoses, so that they can either be burned or stored, you have to cleave the bonds, those linkages, those alpha-1,4 linkages. You need an enzyme to do that. That enzyme is called alpha-1,4 glucosidase. It's in your intestine, so it breaks the amylose, but it can only break the amylose on the ends. Can't break from the middle. It's got to break on the ends. And so every time, the enzyme works, you generate one more glucose. So that means that when you're metabolizing amylose, your blood glucose goes up slowly. It goes like this and then comes down. And what that means is you're not getting a peak. You're not getting a big rise. So you're not generating much of an insulin response because your blood glucose isn't changing that much. This is one of the phenomena inherent in this concept called glycemic index. Amylose has a lower glycemic index. Now, amylose, because it needs that alpha-1,4 glucosidase, and some people don't have that much alpha-1,4 glucosidase, when they eat things that are high in amylose, which, by the way, are beans, lentils, legumes, what happens is they can't cleave as much as they would like, which means that that's available to the bacteria, to the microbiome, which means that they are going to chew it up for their own purposes, which is good, except that one of the side effects is increased carbon dioxide and sometimes hydrogen sulfide, i.e. gas. So it's either fat or fart.
But the point I was trying to stress is the fact that, beans, legumes, lentils, rice, they are just glucose, right?
Not rice.
Okay.
Rice is in the other category.
But there
That's
are
amylopectin.
grains in different plants that are just glucose.
They're all just glucose.
But fruit has fructose as well.
No, fruit is not grains.
No, I'm just trying to make the distinction that sometimes in nature we can find glucose, and then sometimes we can find glucose and fructose.
Right. So in fruit, we see both. In grains, we see only glucose.
That's what I was getting at.
But that glucose can be arranged in two forms. It can be arranged as amylose or amylopectin. So amylopectin, let's finish that up. Amylopectin looks more like a tree. Instead of a string, it looks more like a tree. It's got branches. Now, the branch is not an alpha-1,4 linkage. It's an alpha-1,6 linkage. So one glucose can go this direction and it can also go down this direction. And so you end up with a tree with multiple branches, almost looks like a globule. And what that means is that you can have multiple enzymes attacking that molecule of amylopectin all at once because it's not just working from the ends. And because of that, you can liberate glucose much more rapidly. And so you get a much bigger glucose response. You get a higher glycemic excursion in your blood. And that means that your beta cell is going to see that and it's going to release more insulin. And so people say amylopectin is more insulinogenic, therefore more obesogenic than amylose. And this is the concept behind glycemic index. So you want things that are low glycemic index. However, I am not a fan of this concept. I am a fan of the concept of keeping your insulin down. That I am a fan of. But there's a much easier way to keep your insulin down, and it's called fiber. So all those grains come with their inherent fiber. Okay? They all come with their inherent fiber. Wheat comes with its inherent fiber. It's called husk. Okay? Rice comes with its inherent fiber. It's the, husk of the rice kernel. Okay? brown rice, quinoa, etc. They all come with their inherent fiber. Fiber reduces the rate of absorption of both amylose and amylopectin. And so you end up with a lower glycemic excursion, no matter which it is, amylose or amylopectin. And so fiber is much more important. Now, that concept is called glycemic load. And all real food is a low glycemic load food. And so that's what I'm for. But I am for keeping the insulin down. And that's sort of a standard mantra amongst, the scientists in the obesity field now.
So it sounds like the solution to all this is to stick with food in its whole form, get the fiber,
Yep.
Slow down digestion.
Yep.
Glucose spikes are going to be less.
Yep.
And our body's going to be able to handle things and absorb them in a healthier way.
Absolutely. And you're going to feed your gut. So what we've learned is you have to protect your liver, which we've been talking about, and you have to feed your gut. And what does the gut want to eat? It wants to eat fiber. Fiber is the food for the bacteria.
Well, let's take that to the extreme and talk about somebody who is fasting or somebody that adopts a carnivore diet or primarily meat diet, and they're seeing certain health benefits in that realm. Is that only temporary, or is there exceptions when we go to those extremes when it comes to the gut?
So fiber is the natural food for the intestine. And what the bacteria in the intestine can chew up fiber for its own purposes. And one of the things it will do is it will turn that fiber into a secondary product called the short-chain fatty acids, SCFAs. And those short-chain fatty acids have effects on us. They are anti-inflammatory. They keep inflammation down. And gut inflammation is one of the primary sources of chronic metabolic disease. So keeping your gut placated and generating short-chain fatty acids is part and parcel of improved metabolic health. So fiber is the primary driver of that. However, there are other things that bacteria can do to, consume, to metabolize the nutrients it needs and also generate short-chain fatty acids. So fiber is necessary to keep your gut happy, but your gut will secondarily be able to chew on amino acids and or other organic acids that you can find in meat and other foods that will do just as well. I am not against a carnivore diet. And I've not been against a carnivore diet for a long time. Okay? I don't advocate it, but I'm not against it. I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to move here, but do you see that chair over there?
I do.
There's a lot of stuff on it right now, okay? But you see that chair? That is a very important and special chair, okay? That chair belonged to a man by the name of Williamer Stephenson. Williamer Stephenson was an explorer. He was born in North Dakota to Icelandic parents, didn't speak English until he was 17, went to Harvard, though. Ultimately went to the Arctic, was shipwrecked amongst the Inuit for 2 years before he was rescued, and recognized that the Eskimos, the Inuit, had no diabetes, no heart disease, and no cancer. And so he was a little bit of an anthropologist as well as being an explorer. He was one of the founding members of the Explorers Club. He wrote many books, one called Cancer, a Disease of Civilization, and he trained the ski troops during World War II for the Brunner Pass. Williamer Stephenson was an American hero. That chair behind me was Williamer Stephenson's Harvard chair. And my mother's late husband's brother-in-law was Williamer Stephenson. And we owned Stephenson Farm for many years in Bethel, Vermont. Really very fascinating story. Bottom line, William or Stephenson knew that you could live on whale blubber, you could live on meat, and be perfectly healthy. So he and his partner in the in the Arctic exploration checked themselves into NYU Bellevue back in 1926 and lived on the metabolic ward at NYU Bellevue for a year and ate only meat for 1 solid year. And it turned out at the end of the year, they were healthier than the investigators who were studying them. And of course, this got written up in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, 1928, multiple papers about it, and it's one of the reasons he wrote the book, Cancer, Disease of Civilization, etc. Point is, you can be on a ketogenic diet, you can be on a carnivore diet, and it will work. It will work. Okay? And there are many, many tribes that consume nothing but meat and milk, the Rendelia, the Tokelau, the Maasai, the Inuit, okay, and they are fine because this is their indigenous culture and because you can get enough out of a carnivore diet to be able to maintain health. You can also get enough out of a gatherer diet, okay, and to maintain health. But in order to do so, you have to eat the requisite fiber.
And you mentioned there the fact that the gut bacteria can actually feed on other things besides fiber.
Yes.
When somebody's consuming only meat.
That's right. Exactly. So there are different ways to do it, and I'm not married to either one. I'm very agnostic in terms of this. People get to choose. But the one diet that never works, not in the history of mankind, is the standard American diet. That's the diet that doesn't work.
I realized when I threw that last question to you, I lumped together carnivore plus fasting. And obviously, the nuance of your answer there, the fact that gut bacteria can feed on meat and not necessarily just fiber, leaves the fact that what happens when we fast?
Well, and what it does is it makes the gut bacteria want to grow. It makes them want more. And if you don't feed your gut bacteria will feed on you. So it will actually strip the mucin layer right off your intestinal epithelial cells. So it will find its food, okay? And now your intestinal epithelial cells don't have the physical protection that it needed to keep the gut microbiome at bay. I mean, your intestine is a sewer, okay, at every level, okay? There's a lot in your intestine. And the goal is to keep that in the intestine and not in your bloodstream. So there are 3 barriers in your intestine to separate you from the junk in it. The first is the physical barrier, the mucin layer. And like I said, if you don't feed your gut will feed on you. The second barrier is the biochemical barrier. They are called tight junctions. They are proteins that link the intestinal epithelial cells together so that things can't get through. But there are things that can poison those tight junctions, and then they come apart and things can get through. That's called leaky gut. And the things that can damage those tight junctions are wheat gluten in people who are gluten allergic. They're called celiac disease. Those tight junctions, like the example of that is zonulins. That's what goes wrong in celiac disease. They go like that. But it turns out fructose nitrates those tight junctions and renders them ineffective also. So fructose can basically generate leaky gut all by itself. And then the third barrier is the immunologic barrier. So your intestine has more immune cells than the rest of your body put together. It's got all these things called Peyer's patches where all the lymphocytes hang out. And those lymphocytes are special kinds of lymphocytes. They are Th17 cells, and they make a cytokine called IL-17. And their job is to basically patrol the entire gut and make sure that stuff doesn't get across. Recent paper out of Ivanoff's group at Columbia showed that on a regular whole foods diet, those Peyer's patches, those Th17 cells, that IL-17 is all functional, working, and the barrier is intact. On a ketogenic diet, a high-fat diet, low-carbohydrate diet, it's also intact and keeps all the junk out. And the Th17 and the IL-17 is fine. The minute you add sugar to the fat, now that barrier is not there. The immunologic barrier has been broached. The Th17 cells are missing. The IL-17 is way down. And fat from the intestine starts conglomerating on the other side and gets into the bloodstream, which can then cause inflammation.
And then tying back to what we talked about before, sugars in nature are going to be found with fiber. And this is going to form this lattice work that I know you've talked about before on the show,
right,
on our first conversation. And I've heard you talk about it on other podcasts, where the soluble fiber and insoluble fiber, they mesh together and form that barrier, which is going to slow down digestion.
Right. So that's the man-made barrier, as it were, or the food barrier. So there's really 4 barriers, but 3 are inherent in the intestine, and 1 is dependent on the food. And the bottom line is the goal is to keep your barrier intact. And, we're not. We are basically destroying that barrier, therefore generating gut inflammation, therefore generating systemic inflammation, therefore generating mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance.
Well, as we come up on time here, let's make sure we get really practical, tie everything together for people. We know fructose is a big part of this problem, the biggest, and
It's not the only part, but it's the biggest part, and it's the part we could fix tomorrow.
Okay. So in a practical sense, we know that fructose can be found in nature in things like honey or fruit. Let's get really practical with people. We talked about all the negative downsides of fructose. How do we, in a practical way, eat in a way where fructose isn't going to damage our mitochondria, which again is at the top of this whole chain, and then all the problems are downstream?
Very simple. Eat fruit. But that's it. In terms of fructose content, you need to look at the added sugars on the side of the label. Fruit doesn't have a label. That's okay. Food that doesn't have a label hasn't been processed. Food that doesn't have a label has its inherent fiber still there. The minute they do something to the food, now they got to put a label on it. So whenever they have a label on it, you have to look at the degree of processing. And one of the ways to do that is to look at the number of grams of added sugar that's now listed on the label. And the higher that is, the more you don't want it. It's just that simple. The goal is to keep your consumption of added sugars below 25 grams a day. That would be 6 teaspoons. That's about what your liver can handle. Very similar to, by the way, to what your liver can do with alcohol. That's about as much as your liver can handle alcohol, too. And the reason is because alcohol and fructose are metabolized the same way. So it makes sense that about 6 teaspoons of of sugar, therefore 3 teaspoons or 12 grams of fructose, 25 grams of sugar, because they're 50-50, would be sort of the maximum. If you eat whole food, you have nothing to worry about. Because if you eat whole food, your fructose content beyond fruit is minimal. And the fruit has fructose, but not very much, and you're not going to absorb it because of the fiber. So, the goal is to eat as unprocessed a diet as you can. And whether you want to go more toward the plant-based or whether you want to go more toward the animal-based, I think that's up to you. What do you prefer? Okay. I don't have a horse in the race. Either one will work. Either one can be healthy. Now, if you go extremes on either side, there might be problems depending on how you do it. So, there you might need supplementation. But if you stick in the middle, you can go either way. I personally think a pescatarian diet is like the best diet. That's the one I would choose if I could get everybody to recognize that fish has some really good things in it, and things you can't get pretty much anywhere else. And so you want to eat mostly vegetables? Fine, great, terrific. Add a little bit of fish so you can get your omega-3s and your tryptophan and your methionine, and we're good to go.
Are you a pescatarian?
I eat meat. I shouldn't say I'm a pescatarian because that suggests I don't eat meat. I'm sort of a flexitarian, is really what I am. Let me be honest. I love fish. I eat fish as often as I can, but I do eat meat. You might see me barbecuing. No question. I consider myself a flexitarian more than a pescatarian.
I know we're coming up on time, but I want to hit on two quick things before we part ways. One being that when we think of fructose being a problem, the way I'm hearing you say it is that it becomes a problem when it's out of its whole food form. But the thing I want to caveat and add to that is the fact that we can process things in our own kitchen through juicing and blending, pulverizing fruit up into, very fine bits when it comes to a blender or juicing. Then we're no longer, even though that food didn't have a label originally, we're no longer talking about it from this perspective of having that safety net of fiber.
That's right. As soon as you've juiced it, as soon as you've pulverized it, as soon as you've smoothied it, okay, it's not whole anymore. And you'll notice, okay, if you buy an orange at the store, it doesn't have a label. But if you buy an orange smoothie in a bottle, it does have a label. Okay? Maybe nothing's been added, but something's been removed. It's been processed. And now it needs a label. That's the way you need to look at it. So every label is a warning label. And you have to look at the label to determine how much of a warning it is. It might not be that much of a warning, or it might be a very big warning. And there are ways to figure it out. And they're in my book, Metabolical, and they're on the internet, and I've posted on this many, many times. Ultimately, it's not what's in the food, it's what's been done to the food that matters. And sometimes you can't learn that from a food label.
All right. I know, again, we got to part ways, but we'll end on this. We started talking about insulin resistance, and then we went upstream from there to the mitochondrial dysfunction. I want to make sure we come full circle and address the insulin resistance piece, make sure we hammer that home, how it fits into all of this. So can you take that and make sure we fully explain how that fits into this when it comes to the mitochondria and working its way down?
Keep your insulin down, okay? The best way to keep insulin down is don't let it go up. Well, what makes insulin go up? Refined carbohydrate and sugar. So refined carbohydrate is carbohydrate without fiber, and sugar is sugar. Those are the things you have to watch. Those are the things that you have to be careful about. Unfortunately, those are the primary components of processed food. So the less processed, the lower the insulin. The lower the insulin, the less mitochondrial dysfunction. The less mitochondrial dysfunction, the healthier you are.
And how does somebody know if they're facing a problem when it comes to, consuming sugar? We talked about the fact that, the liver gets fatty, that leads to these metabolic diseases. Is there a way before we get to that point that we can tell, like, things are going awry? We quickly talked about weight gain there. Let's talk about how good of a tool that is for determining how far off we've come with sugar.
So what you're asking is, what's the metric for determining sugar consumption and ultimately metabolic health? And the answer to that is complicated. Most people use weight. And I think that is a bad idea. I think it's a very bad idea. Now, why do I think that's a bad idea? The first reason is because 20% of obese people are metabolically healthy. Conversely, 40% of normal weight people are metabolically ill. In fact, 88% of America has some metabolic deficit, according to an article from 2019. And not all of them are obese. And the reason is because there are 3 fat depots. One is called subcutaneous or big butt fat, as in, does this bathing suit make me look fat? Never answer that question. Turns out that fat is metabolically healthy. That's what your body wants to do with energy, is put it into the subcutaneous fat so that it is not dangerous. The second fat depot is visceral fat, or big belly fat. That is not good for you. But the cause of visceral fat is not calories. The cause of visceral fat is cortisol and stress. Now, cortisol and stress will make you eat more, but the visceral fat itself is responsive to cortisol and stress. And then finally, the third fat depot is the liver fat. And that liver fat depot is directly related to sugar. So the amount of fat in your liver is a marker for sugar. So how can you determine what that is? And there are several ways. One is your waist circumference. That's the cheap, free, easy way. But it's sensitive, not specific. There are other things that can make your waist go up too. Another one is fasting insulin. That you can get on a fasting blood sample, but your physician has to draw it and has to know how to interpret it, and a lot of them don't. And then the third is an ALT, an alanine aminotransferase, which is a blood test that is normally gotten during a standard chem panel. But you have to be able to interpret that correctly, and most doctors don't interpret it correctly. And the reason is because the reference range has changed over time. And so they think a number is normal when it's not. The upper limit of ALT is 25, but on the lab slip, the upper limit of ALT is 40. So how come it was 25 and now it's 40? The answer is because everyone's got fatty liver now. 45% of America has fatty liver. So their ALT has gone up. All right. So all of these things are potential ways of figuring it out. And then, of course, there are more expensive ways, like, for instance, MRI and hepatic elastography, et cetera. Those are really, really expensive and, much more complicated and really only available on a research basis. But, blood tests will help.
And when it comes to liver fat, you mentioned sugar, and that's what we've been talking about here, that, if it's being consumed in excess, is going to lead to a fatty liver. But what other things can lead to a fatty liver, and what can cloud that water? I'm assuming alcohol would fit under that umbrella, but what else?
So there are a lot of things that cause fatty liver. There alcohol, but kids don't drink alcohol. And today, 25% of kids have fatty liver. Trans fats can cause fatty liver, but we now know that trans fats are bad for us, and so they're coming down, so that's good. And then another one, which people don't know, is branched-chain amino acids. Now, branched-chain amino acids are leucine, isoleucine, valine. These are 3 essential amino acids. You have to consume them. You have to eat them. Your body doesn't make them. And they are 20% of muscle. Those 3. They're very, very high in muscle. And this is why bodybuilders put protein powder in their smoothie shakes, is to increase their branched-chain amino acid consumption so they can build more muscle. And if you're a bodybuilder, you need them, because you can't make the muscle without them. Okay, but what if you're not a bodybuilder? What if you're a mere mortal like me, and you're sort of finished growing, and you're not trying to grow your muscle per se, and you consume excess branched-chain amino acids, which, by the way, are in corn-fed beef, chicken, and fish, because they're in corn. They're very high in corn. All right, what does your body do with the excess branched-chain amino acids? They go to the liver. The liver deamidates them, takes the amino group off. Now they become branched-chain organic acids. And then they go into the Krebs cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle, the cycle that basically burns energy to make ATP. Well, again, just like we talked about before, there's a limit. There's an upper limit to how fast that thing can run, how fast it can metabolize. And if you overwhelm it, just like fructose does, you're going to turn the excess into liver fat. And it'll lay down, and now you've got chronic metabolic disease too. So that liver fat has multiple sources. But by far and away, the biggest one, and the one that we can fix tomorrow if we wanted to, is sugar.
Let's get into the nuances of taking that story even further. From fatty liver, we know that eventually that leads to insulin resistance and then to the metabolic diseases. But let's talk about that. So we're at the point now where we've overloaded the liver with, sugar or these other variables that we just talked about. Talk about the physiology there of how that leads to insulin resistance.
Fat in the liver makes your insulin receptor not transduce its signal very well. When you have fat in the liver, instead there's a protein in the liver called IRS1, insulin receptor substrate 1. And normally when insulin's working, it is tyrosine phosphorylated, but it could also be serine phosphorylated. And it turns out that the enzyme that serine phosphorylates that IRS1 is driven by the amount of fat in the liver. In addition, we have learned recently that the liver doesn't just make standard fat, doesn't make just triglyceride, but it makes a different kind of fat entirely called ceramides. Okay, the example of ceramides that you know about, that you deal with every day, is earwax. That's what earwax is ceramides. Okay? Earwax is kind of sticky, yeah? All right? Well, it turns out your liver makes ceramides. Makes sticky stuff. And it turns out that fructose consumption increases liver ceramide production, which again correlates with the de novo lipogenesis, the fat making, and also the insulin sensitivity. We published that recently, about a month ago, in the journal Nutrients. So, bottom line, fat in the liver, not good. That's not what you want. And sugar is the primary lipogenic substrate. It is the thing that makes fat in the liver go up fastest, worst. And that's why children have fatty liver. So this is, job one, is to clear the fat out of your liver. You want to know why exercise works? Because it gives your liver a chance to burn fat. You want to know why intermittent fasting works? Because it gives your liver a chance to burn off the fat. So all of the maneuvers that we know about that are associated with improvement in metabolic health and improvement in longevity are all targeted at the liver.
And then if somebody does decide they want to, take care of the liver, and maybe they've done testing and they've realized there is an accumulation of fat there, or they just, subjectively assume and they want to do the work, and they crank up their exercise or they start intermittent fasting, how quickly can that turn around?
Our data shows that you can turn that around in 9 days flat. So we did a study here at UCSF looking at 43 children with metabolic syndrome. Okay, all Latino and African American. So all, low socioeconomic status, high sugar consumers, all with obesity plus at least one comorbidity. And what we did was we figured out what they were eating at home at baseline. We studied them on their home baseline diet. And then, for the next 9 days, we catered their meals. No added sugar. We took the percent calories from their diet, as that was added sugar, 28% median, and we brought it down to 10%. Okay. Now, if you do that, you're going to get 350 to 400 calories out of the diet each day. in which case, if you did that for 10 days, you might lose weight. We didn't want them to lose weight, because if they lost weight, people would say, well, of course they got better, they lost weight. We wanted them to stay the same weight or even gain weight. So we had to replace the 350 to 400 calories per day that we were taking out as removal of sugar and add something that was equicaloric. We gave them refined starch. So we gave them more glucose. We took out the fructose and gave them more glucose. We did a glucose for fructose exchange. So in the vernacular, we took the pastries out, we put the bagels in. We took the sweetened yogurt out, we put the baked potato chips in. We took the chicken teriyaki out, we put the turkey hot dogs in. All right? So we didn't give them good food, we gave them crappy food. We gave them processed food, we gave them kid food kids would eat. But it was no added sugar food. And we gave them a scale. And every day, we'd call them up on the phone, what'd you weigh? And if it turned out they were losing weight, eat more! In order to keep their weight constant over the course of the 10 days. And then we studied them again 10 days later. And what we showed was with no change in calories and no change in weight, and no change in subcutaneous or big butt fat, the visceral fat went down 7%, the liver fat went down 22%. The turning of sugar into fat went down 46%. The triglyceride in the blood went down 49%. And their pancreases started making insulin properly again. In other words, we reversed their metabolic syndrome in 10 days with no change in calories, no change in weight. So you can actually affect things pretty quickly if you know what you're doing. And the funny part was, remember, we were giving them crappy food. What if we didn't give them the crappy food? How much faster and how much better would that have worked? So, I think that diet is by far and away the most manipulable item, in terms of improving metabolic health. And you don't have to wait that long for the effect to kick in.
You mentioned what if you guys would have given better quality food. There's also the whole layer too of exercise and intermittent fasting. If you would have layered those in as well, you can only imagine how quickly things could have turned around. Right, absolutely. So, the more things you throw at it, the better off you'll be. And yes, we used exercise, we used intermittent fasting, but the bottom line is, if you ate real food in the first place, you wouldn't have to exercise or intermittently fast. The other thing to know about exercise, which is really important for your audience, people think, well, I can run off my bad diet. I can exercise away my bad diet. And if this were a calorie issue, then maybe that would be true. You could basically increase your energy burning to account for the excess energy intake. 3 hours of running is a Big Mac. It makes no sense, but that's what, the exercise people, like to, quote and talk about. And I think this is ridiculous. The bottom line is there are 8 subcellular pathologies going on that are driving metabolic disease. We've talked about one, glycation, but there are 7 others, and I'll name them for you real quick. Oxidative stress, mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin resistance, membrane instability, inflammation, methylation, and autophagy. Now, you never hear about any of these. And the reason you never hear about any of these is because doctors don't know about them. Number 2, there's no medicine for any of them. And so, and there's no ICD-11 code for them. So, why would your doctor bring up something that he doesn't understand, doesn't know how to explain, doesn't know what it's for, and can't bill for it anyway? Bottom line is those 8 subcellular pathologies, and in my book, Metabolic, I call them the hateful 8. Okay, those are the causes of chronic disease and aging.
4 of them, 4 of the 8, are responsive to exercise. Mitochondrial dysfunction, insulin resistance, inflammation, and autophagy are responsive to exercise. Now, that's good. I'm not saying that's bad. That's good. But it's not all 8. The other 4 are not responsive to exercise. So you cannot outrun a bad diet. You still have to fix the diet.
So given you just shared all 8 with us, how do we go about making sure we've got a good balance with a healthy lifestyle to cover all those in a good way? So obviously diet's a big piece of this. Exercise covers 4. What are a handful of lifestyle factors that people can, make sure they're doing on a regular basis to keep all those in check?
Well, the main thing is eating properly. Now, eating properly is complicated, all right, because you think you're eating properly and you're not, because the information you need to determine whether you're eating properly is not on the nutrition facts label, all right? The nutrition facts label tells you what's in the food. What I'm telling you is what's really important is what's been done to the food. Sometimes it's what's been taken out of the food. You don't find that out on the nutrition facts label. Sometimes it's what the food's turned into. You don't find that on the nutrition facts label. Okay, all of these things that basically you can't learn about unless you know a whole lot about food science, which, I do, but you don't. And that's why I wrote the book Metabolic, is to teach you that. The easiest way to do that is to shop the periphery of the grocery store. Okay, stay away from, stuff that's been sprayed with, this pesticide or that, insecticide. Glyphosate is an example of something that causes hepatic damage. Okay, Roundup. Well, turns out, we're bathed in glyphosate every day. The industry tells you glyphosate's not dangerous. Yeah, but you know what? Now, there are lawsuits, in the billions against, Monsanto, which ultimately was bought by Bayer, over glyphosate causing cancer. Well, the fact of the matter is it causes metabolic disease as well. And we know why, because it's an amino acid derivative. It's an amino acid analog of glycine. That's why it's called glyphosate. And so it's changing your proteins, and so your proteins don't bend and aren't as resilient as they used to be because of glyphosate. So, these are all things that you sort of need to know. Another thing that's a major problem are exposure to obesogens. These are chemicals in our environment that actually promote weight gain and chronic metabolic disease. Now, some of them are in the food. Some of them are in healthcare products like parabens, like in cosmetics, and some of them are in plastics like bisphenol A or phthalates, or some of them are in flame retardants, which is in your mattress and in your kids' clothing. Okay, and some are more ubiquitous, like air pollution. Turns out air pollution is an obesogen. So how do you avoid all of these things when they're everywhere? And this is a major problem. And it may explain why everyone's gaining weight. It may explain why body temperature has been going down over the last 150 years. Because the only way for body temperature to be going down is for our mitochondria not to be working as well. So, this is a big nut to crack. And, I'm not going to tell you I have all the answers. But of the various things that you could do to improve your metabolic health, by far and away, fixing your diet is the easiest and best way.
And when it comes to complementing the diet, are you a big fan of including any supplements?
So, supplements are complicated, and I'll tell you why. Most supplements don't get to where they need to go. Where they need to go is the mitochondria, and most supplements don't get there. Okay, either they don't get absorbed or they just don't end up, getting to where they need to inside the cell. So there are a lot of people who say, oh, well, there's supplements to boost mitochondrial function, like, for instance, CoQ10. And if CoQ10 actually got to the mitochondria, that would be good, but it doesn't. All right? And there's no studies that actually show that CoQ10 supplementation makes a damn bit of difference. Okay. Nonetheless, they're, advertised ad nauseum by celebrities on TV. That doesn't mean they work. Same thing with curcumin, turmeric, etc. These are all great ideas if they worked, but they don't necessarily work. Having said that, there are 3 supplements I take. The first one is omega-3 fatty acids. And omega-3 fatty acids are necessary for appropriate neurotransmission and cardiovascular risk reduction. You need a different omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Omega-6s are pro-inflammatory, omega-3s are anti-inflammatory, and omega-3s are necessary for normal neuronal membranes and normal neural signaling. And you only get omega-3s from wild fish, and no one eats enough wild fish. The other second supplement that I take every day is vitamin C. Now, I don't take Linus Pauling levels of vitamin C. I take 1,000 milligrams. And the reason I take vitamin C is because I have rosacea, and it's been shown that rosacea helps stabilize collagen and helps stabilize blood vessel in the skin. So it hopefully, keeps my rosacea at bay. And lastly, I take vitamin D. Vitamin D is good for bones to some extent, although not as good as everyone makes it out to be. And it also is an immune regulator. And it turns out that vitamin D deficiency seems to actually correlate with increased inflammatory diseases, including COVID-19 response. Okay, and the reason is because vitamin D suppresses toll-like receptors, specifically toll-like receptor 4. Which are necessary to mount an appropriate immune response. So it basically keeps the lid on your immune system. So those are the 3 that I take. The others are questions. There's not enough data to support their general use. They're not going to hurt you, but the question is, are they going to help you? And, the jury's still out on those.
What about vitamin K2? You mentioned D there. That's often found together.
With K2?
Yeah.
Your intestine, the intestinal bacteria, make vitamin K, both K1 and K2. And I've not seen anybody who needed to have extra vitamin K. Well, unless you're a newborn, in which case you get a vitamin K injection in the newborn nursery to prevent hemorrhagic disease in the newborn.
We quickly touched on intermittent fasting. Is that something you do on a daily basis? And talk about what your meals look like.
I don't tell anybody about my food. I eat real food as much as possible. That's what I will say. Okay? And I'm careful about my desserts. If I'm going to have a dessert, it better be a damn good one. I make desserts special.
Rob, I want to get started today talking about insulin and insulin resistance, and the latter being such an important topic because it's affecting so many people these days. Oftentimes, people don't know they're affected by it till way later on, years even, and it's something that if people know about it, they can prevent or reverse. So before we get into the chronic state, insulin resistance, let's set the stage here and talk about what insulin is, and then we'll move into that.
Right, absolutely. Insulin's where the action is. Insulin is the bad guy in the story. And when you understand insulin and insulin resistance, you understand all of these chronic metabolic diseases. But I will tell you that insulin resistance is actually downstream of something even more important that we will talk about called mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondrial dysfunction is where, all of these diseases conglomerate. All of the diseases that we are talking about in this thing called metabolic syndrome. So type 2 diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, fatty liver disease, polycystic ovarian disease. The diseases that affect 75% of the population and cost 75% of today's healthcare dollars are all the diseases of mitochondria. And when your mitochondria don't work, you get insulin resistance. Now, let's go back to insulin. Insulin is the diabetes hormone. That means that diabetics take shots of insulin. Indeed, they do. And they need to take shots of insulin in order to lower their blood glucose. And having a high blood glucose is bad for you. But having a high blood glucose is a manifestation of the problem, not the problem itself. Because if you didn't have the mitochondrial dysfunction, you wouldn't have the high blood glucose. So the high blood glucose is downstream of the actual problem. And insulin is a way to, shall we say, cover up the problem. So yes, diabetics take shots of insulin. So insulin is known as the diabetes hormone. Really, what insulin is the energy storage hormone. Insulin takes glucose from the blood and also fats from the blood in the form of triglyceride and stuffs it in cells for a rainy day. So it will take glucose and put it into cells of the body, including fat, and it will take circulating triglyceride off VLDL and activate the enzyme on the surface of the fat cell called lipoprotein lipase, which will snarf lipid out of triglycerides and store it in fat. So basically, insulin does everything it can to increase your fat. Insulin makes fat. Period. Full stop. More insulin, more fat. So, insulin's a bad guy in the story for just that reason. Now, normally, when you eat something and your blood glucose goes up, your beta cell, the insulin secreting cell of your pancreas, senses that the glucose went up and it is trying to clear that glucose, to put that glucose into storage for a rainy day, your rainy day hormone, if you will, okay, to save up for when you need it most, all right? And so glucose will make insulin go up. That is true. But that insulin should put that glucose into fat cells where it can't do any damage. If your mitochondria are dysfunctional, then that's not working very well, okay? And you're not burning very well. And so when insulin then shoves energy into organs, in particular fat, it's not doing a very good job of it. It's not clearing it. And so the levels of insulin have to go up in order to make the rest of the cells, especially the liver, do its job. That's insulin resistance. Now the question is, why are the mitochondria not doing their job? Why is the cell not responding to insulin? That's the issue. Different tissues, different reasons, but the main one is the liver. And what we've learned is that the primary driver of insulin resistance is liver fat. Fat in the liver. Now, once upon a time, 50 years ago, if you had fat in your liver, you were an alcoholic, period. That was the only thing that caused fat in the liver. Today, 45% of the U.S. population has fatty liver disease. Now, notice I didn't say 45% of the obese U.S. population. I said 45% of the whole U.S. population and 25% of the children. And notice I didn't say obese children. I said all children have fatty liver disease. Back in 1975, no one had it other than alcoholics. This is the biggest pandemic of all. Okay, this leaves COVID in the friggin' dust in terms of incidence and prevalence. Okay, it just doesn't kill you in 5 days like COVID did. Instead, it kills you in more like 15 to 20 years. But this is truly the biggest pandemic. Now, why does the liver store more fat? Why is the liver not burning that energy? And therefore, why does the insulin have to go up? And that's what this is really all about. Why are the mitochondria not working? Because if they were working, then number one, you wouldn't be storing the liver fat. Number two, your liver would remain insulin sensitive. And number three, your pancreas wouldn't have to make enough insulin, that much insulin to make the liver do its job, in which case, then you wouldn't be shunting sugar to fat. It's just that simple. So what caused the mitochondrial dysfunction? The answer to that is multiple things, but the one that is, sort of front and center, the one that is sort of everywhere, the one that you can't seem to escape is sugar. Dietary sugar, the fructose molecule, the sweet molecule in sugar, the molecule we seek, the molecule that makes it taste good, the molecule that is, in fact, addictive.
Well, there's a lot of moving pieces with this story. I want to make sure we stop and kind of recap where we're at before we continue here. So we have the insulin resistance piece, we have the fatty liver, we have the mitochondrial dysfunction, and we're trying to get to the root of all this, which is the mitochondria and the problem there, which has led us to sugar and fructose.
Right.
So I'll have you take the story and continue it there. Just wanted that little recap.
You bet. There are a lot of things that can damage the mitochondria. Okay? Poor diet in general will damage the mitochondria because the mitochondria are made of fats, but they're made of specific fats. And if you don't get enough of those specific fats in your diet, essential fatty acids in your diet, you can't make good mitochondria and they go bad easily, in which case you have mitochondrial dysfunction because you didn't eat the right fats. Not all fat is the same. There are 7 classes of fats. And the ones that you care most about here are the polyunsaturated fatty acids, and in particular, the omega-3s. They make the mitochondria work better, but they're in very short supply in our diet. So even before sugar, you have to actually make good mitochondria. Another thing that causes mitochondrial dysfunction is radiation. Radiation will cause mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is actually a problem up in outer space, because we have now learned from metabolomic studies on blood and urine of people who've been, working on the space shuttle, that they have inherent mitochondrial dysfunction just from the ambient radiation because they're not protected by the Earth's atmosphere. So can you imagine what's going to happen on a Mars mission? They'll be lucky if they can crawl out of the capsule when they get back home because their mitochondria are going to be so dysfunctional. So how do you protect people up in outer space? This is actually a big issue for the National Space Agency, and I've actually consulted with them on this. Other things that cause dysfunction of the mitochondria, various obesogens, various toxins in the environment that inhibit mitochondrial function cause weight gain that have nothing to do with calories. So flame retardants, parabens, chlorpyrifos, glyphosate, insecticides, all of these ultimately damage the mitochondria to one extent or another. And we're exposed to all of these as well. So it's a lot of things. It's not one thing. Oh, air pollution. Forgot about air pollution. Particulate matter causes generalized inflammation, causes insulin resistance too. There's a whole bunch of things that lead to this. So, some of them we can do something about, and some of them we can't. But the one that I think is the biggest problem, the one that I think is the most egregious problem, and the reason I think it is because kids are getting these diseases of mitochondrial dysfunction when they never did before. The one I think is the biggest one is sugar. And that's the one that would be eminently fixable if we chose to, because that is purely the food industry's causation. They could fix this if they wanted to, but they don't want to.
Well, let's take some time with each of these because you've named about 4 or 5 different ones there total. And I've heard you talk a lot about sugar. We got into sugar a lot on our last chat, and I do want to dedicate a good part of this conversation to that as well. But let's start with the fatty acid piece. Let's make sure we get all the different pieces here and give people their best chance at mitochondrial health. So we know the polyunsaturated are the piece of this that we want to address, omega-3s. Is it enough to get them through dietary means? Are you a big fan of supplementing them? Let's talk about how somebody goes about getting enough and getting good quality ones.
Right. Now understand there are 7 classes of fats in our diet. 7. And some of them will save your life and some of them will kill you. Okay. There's a big spectrum all the way from one end to the other. Let's take them in order so that people can understand what they are and how they work and where do you find them. So the most important and the most valuable fatty acid is omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3s are heart healthy, they're anti-inflammatory, they're anti-Alzheimer's because they contribute to neuronal structure and function. And it has been shown that when you are omega-3 deficient, you get multiple diseases, including cardiovascular disease and depression. And omega-3s are very sparse in our diet. We don't get enough. And the question is, where do you get omega-3s from? Well, there are 2 places you can get omega-3s from. Okay. You can get them from vegetables. So vegans can get one kind of omega-3. There are 3. They can get one kind. They can get one called alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA. And ALA is good. I'm not saying it's bad. It's a good thing. It is anti-inflammatory. And so it actually affords cardiovascular protection. And that is good. However, the other 2 omega-3s, one is called EPA, or eicosapentaenoic acid, which is necessary for neural transmission. And the third one is called DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, which is necessary for neuronal structure and membrane stability. Those only come from marine life. They only come from fish. Now, do the fish make omega-3s? No. The fish eat the omega-3s. So what makes the omega-3s? Algae. Algae make the omega-3s. The fish eat the algae. We eat the fish. We are getting our omega-3s third hand. Now, vegans don't eat fish. So the question is, how are vegans going to get the EPA and the DHA? And they need the EPA and the DHA because the conversion of ALA, which they do get, to EPA and DHA, which they don't get, is extremely poor. ALA almost doesn't get converted to EPA and DHA. And you need EPA and DHA. So I worry about vegans. So they need to supplement. Vegans need to supplement. And the question is, will they supplement? Because fish oil still comes from fish. And so that's a problem. And not only that, but you have to take fish oil capsules from fish that ate algae. Well, that means wild fish, because farm fish don't eat algae. Farm fish eat corn, and corn is filled with omega-6s. And we're going to get to that at the end. Remember, we said there are 7 classes. That's number 6. That's like on the worst side. All right? So omega-3s are super important. They contribute to mitochondria, they contribute to neuronal membrane stability, they contribute to suppression of inflammation, cardiovascular stability. There are a whole host of things that omega-3s do for you that are positive, that are in your best interest in terms of health. And we don't get enough. Number 2, monounsaturated fatty acids, oleic acid found in olive oil. Now, this is a very good fatty acid. And the reason it's very good fatty acid is because it is the endogenous ligand. Oleic acid is the endogenous ligand for a receptor in your liver called PPAR alpha, peroxisome proliferation activated receptor alpha. And this is the fuel gauge on the liver cell, basically telling the liver to work more efficiently and work better. And so it has a lot to do with energy dynamics. And so when you are low in PPAR alpha, you don't burn energy as well. It has an effect on mitochondria. So olive oil is a good a good fatty acid. The only problem with olive oil is that the bond, the double bond that caused it to be monounsaturated, because that's what we referred to when we were talking about unsaturated, is the double bonds in the fatty acid, which is a long chain of carbons. Okay, there are two kinds of fatty acids. There's cis fatty acids and there are trans fatty acids. You want cis fatty acids. And the reason is because we don't have the enzyme to break a trans double bond. Olive oil is cis fatty acid. That's good. But if you heat olive oil, if you heat oleic acid past its smoking point, which is relatively low for olive oil, 310 degrees Fahrenheit, 165 degrees centigrade, okay, which is easy to do in a saute pan. What you do is you put enough heat across, enough energy across that double bond that it will actually flip. And now you have created a trans fatty acid right in your skillet. And that is poison. We're going to get to that as number 7. So you got to be careful about olive oil. Olive oil is meant to be consumed at room temperature. Number 3, polyunsaturated fatty acids. So polyunsaturated fatty acids are also good. They are good for several reasons. They are good because they are anti-inflammatory, but they also can flip their double bonds, and there are more double bonds to flip. The good news is most of the polyunsaturated fatty acids have a higher smoking point, so it's a little harder to make that trans fat switch. That's true. But it's also been shown that if you consume too many polyunsaturated fatty acids, you're going to end up with immune problems with your immune system. Number 4, saturated fatty acids. Now, everyone thinks saturated fatty acids are the devil incarnate. They think that is the worst of all the fatty acids. And the reason they think that is because that's what we were told for 45 years. That's what, Ansel Keys told us back in the 1960s and 70s. Saturated fat was evil. Okay, and why we all needed to go low fat because saturated fat was bad for you. In addition, because saturated fat is animal fat, okay, comes from, lard and from pigs and from cows. And saturated fat, if you get rid of saturated fat, that means you're getting rid of the cows and the pigs and the goats and everything. And the vegans would like that very much. So there's sort of a feed-forward problem there. Turns out saturated fat is not one saturated fat. There are 2. There's even-chain saturated fatty acids, which are what's in red meat. And then there are odd-chain saturated fatty acids, which are what's in dairy. Turns out the odd-chain saturated fatty acids are metabolized differently than the even-chain. And also the odd-chain saturated fatty acids have a different phospholipid signature. They have a tail on the end, which makes them polar, which makes them actually do very different things in the body because they can basically bind to other things and activate other things. That phospholipid is very important. And it turns out that phospholipid signature is anti-inflammatory. So it turns out the dairy saturated fat is actually anti-inflammatory, whereas red meat saturated fat is not. But it's not pro-inflammatory either. In converse to what Ansel Keys told us. So, saturated fat, neither good nor bad from that standpoint. And dairy saturated fat, actually good. Number 5, medium chain triglycerides. So these are very short triglycerides, usually on the order of about 10 to 14 carbons long, whereas a standard fatty acid would be 16 to 20 or 22 even carbons long. So 10 to 14 carbons. Turns out these are metabolized differently. They are absorbed differently. They are not absorbed in my cells and go through the lacteals and the lymphatic system. They end up going straight to the liver. Now, lots of people are excited about medium chain triglycerides because they're relatively high in coconut oil. And coconut oil is on every paleo and every vegan, menu as being a primary, fat to cook in. And there may be some value to that. But the problem is that when your liver is presented with both saturated fat and medium chain triglycerides, you're basically overwhelming your mitochondria's ability to oxidize. And so you can end up laying down more liver fat, and that can be a problem too. So medium chain triglycerides are sort of a good news, bad news deal, depending on what else you're eating. Number 6, omega-6 fatty acids. Now, omega-6 fatty acids are what are found in seed oils. So soybean oil, etc. They are pro-inflammatory. Okay, omega-6s are the precursors, so like linoleic acid is omega-6. Remember, the other one's alpha-linolenic acid, ALA. This is linoleic acid, LA. They are not the same. They are very different. Okay, one's omega-3, the other one's omega-6. They sound the same, but they're not. They are the precursors of arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid is the precursor to all of the pro-inflammatory cytokines, thromboxanes, eicosanoids, leukotrienes. Okay, all things that generate inflammation. Now, you need inflammation, otherwise you'd be eaten by the maggots. You need inflammation to be able to clear an infection. Okay, so in an acute situation, omega-6s are good because they will help you get rid of, whatever is trying to invade your body. But you certainly don't want that inflammation to be going on willy-nilly without an acute stimulus. And the problem is the more omega-6s, the more chronic inflammation. And that's bad for you every which way. And, will ultimately lead to early demise. So keeping the omega-6 levels down is wise. And omega-6s basically have taken over our entire diet. We talk about the need for an omega-6 to omega-3 ratio of about 3-to-1. Optimally, it should be 1-to-1, but we can do with 3-to-1 or even 4-to-1 and still be reasonably healthy. The problem is our current ratio in America is somewhere between 20 and 25-to-1. Way too many omega-6s, way too few omega-3s. So we need to boost those omega-3s and try to bring down the omega-6s. Now, bringing down the omega-6s is a little bit controversial. Like, for instance, Dariush Mozaffarian thinks we don't need to do that. We do need to raise the omega-3s. He thinks that's enough. I'm not so convinced. I think we do need to get those omega-6s down. And then finally, number 7, the devil incarnate, trans fats. And lots have been written about that. And, the very first trans fat was synthesized in 1902. Crisco was the first one that was patented in 1911. By 1920, they had appeared in virtually all baked goods in America. They are the reason for the 10-year-old Twinkie. And the reason is because bacteria can't digest the trans fats because they can't break the trans double bond. Well, guess what? Our mitochondria are refurbished bacteria. We don't have that enzyme either. We can't cleave that trans double bond either. So basically, a trans fat sits in your liver, never comes out, ultimately leads to fatty liver, cardiovascular disease, basically, it's basically like consuming poison because you can't get rid of it. So there are your 7 fats. And we are getting way too many of the wrong ones and not nearly enough of the right ones. And because of that, we are experiencing mitochondrial dysfunction just on that basis alone.
That's a great overview, and I got a lot of nuance I want to get into within that, starting with the trans fat piece. The way I understand it, trans fats have been at least largely banned in the food supply. We did talk about how if we're cooking with certain oils, we can create them within our own kitchen. How much of a concern are they within the food supply these days in the US?
Well, the good news is that the FDA finally woke up. Took them a long time to wake up. Took a long time to ultimately do something about trans fats. And the reason was because the food industry was pushing, lobbying nonstop for them. And the answer to that is because if you put trans fats in the food, no depreciation. You can increase that sell-by date, to 3 years later, like those Hostess cupcakes, take a look at the sell-by date, they're still good, right? They're not good. They're never good, but they're at least they're consumable. In 1957, the first paper on the toxicity of trans fats was published by a guy at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana by the name of Dr. Fred Kumerow. And he is a hero in this story, and he is a hero to me. And he died not too long ago, maybe about 2 years ago, at age 101 or something like that. Probably because he never ate a trans fat, by the way. But he wrote about this in 1957, and basically it got lost. No one paid any attention to it. No one understood what was going on here. It didn't get resurrected again until 1988 when somebody else started working on it. And then Kumerow basically was still around, and he contributed greatly at that point because he knew and other people started to know. But it took the FDA 25 years from 1988 till 2006 before they would do anything. And the first thing they did was they said, all right, let's put the number of trans fats on the nutrition facts label. And then finally in 2013, so 25 years after, they reappeared in 1988, 25 years later, finally the FDA agreed that they needed to be banned from ultra-processed foods. So they are disappearing. And, for the most part, trans fats have disappeared from the American food supply, which is good.
Are they still able to sneak in a small amount if it falls below a certain limit, or how does that work?
Yes, you're absolutely right. So on the label, they are allowed to say that if they have 0.49 grams of trans fat per serving, they can call 0.490. They round down. They should not be allowed to round down, but the FDA allows them to round down. So if you eat 4 Hostess cupcakes, you have gotten enough trans fat to kill you, because you have gotten basically 2 grams of trans fat, and you were told you got 0. So yes, they lie with numbers.
Okay. So given the fact they lie with numbers and they can still be a problem in the food supply, for somebody that is tuning into this and they're going to ditch ultra-processed foods, are there any other sources? Or if somebody's eating real food, are they going to be clear of that? I'm assuming it's just something from processing, so people should be fine if they avoid those.
Well, milk has very little natural trans fat. You can measure it in milk. Okay, so, some saturated fat will be trans fat, but it is exceedingly small and, for the most part, not to be worried about if it's real food. Really, trans fat is a synthetic phenomenon that the food industry puts in specifically to increase shelf life. So I think that we can ignore the inherent trans fat in real food and focus on just what the industry does to sell their products. And that's what the FDA is worried about.
Let's go back to the history of this whole thing. Processed food, sugar, in the big scheme of things, this is a relatively new issue that humans have had to deal with. Let's go back to the roots of that. How far back does it go, and how did that all become a thing?
Well, sugar's been around since 1200 BC. The Indians, I don't mean the American Indians, the Indian Indians, were able to figure out that they could boil sugar cane down to this brownish, gunky liquid, which was very sweet, which they could then transport. And this stuff was called khanda, Khanda. And of course, that's the derivation of our word candy. It was a delicacy. It was a, rarity. Really through the Middle Ages, only kings could get sugar. And in fact, in many European monarchies, sugar was fetishized. They made like sugar sculptures and stuff, because it was like gold. And, in some places, sugar actually cost more than gold for many years. And of course, that was the genesis of the slave trade, through the 15, 16, 1700s, was all about sugar, molasses to rum to slaves. Bottom line, we built the country, on the backs of slaves, to grow and process sugar, because sugar cane production was backbreaking work. And even today, sugar cane production is associated with all sorts of chronic diseases in the workers. Right? And sugar production is associated with destruction of the Amazon, and it's associated with phosphate runoff in Lake Okeechobee and throughout the Florida Everglades. It's killing the Everglades, all because of sugar production. So this is an enormous problem. And there are many books that have been written on this, like Sweetness and Power by Sidney Mintz and several others. There was another one came out of Canada not too long ago, A Bittersweet History of Sugar. That's right. So this is part of what drove, society forward, but in a very, very bad way. And of course, then oil took over back in 1900. It took over for sugar, in terms of destroying our environment and, but generating, maximum profit. And the bottom line is, they're both hedonic substances.
What I was getting at there is, wasn't a big climax point for sugar when low fat became a thing, like in the 70s?
In 1955, President Eisenhower had a heart attack. He was actually laid up for 6 weeks. And the whole country went berserk. Like, heart attack. And the fact of the matter is that the frequency, the incidence and prevalence of myocardial infarction had been going up and up and up and up. It had been documented by Paul Dudley White, who ended up becoming Eisenhower's physician back in the 1940s. The increase in the rise in heart disease in the United States. But when Eisenhower had a heart attack, that was sort of like the tipping point for this. What causes heart disease? And two camps, basically sprung up from that. One, led by a British physiologist, nutritionist, physician by the name of John Yudkin, said that he believed that sugar was the driver of heart disease. He had correlation. He didn't have causation. But he basically showed that wherever sugar went up, heart disease went up. The other camp was the fat camp, the saturated fat camp. And that was led by a Minnesota epidemiologist by the name of Ansel Keys, who was already famous because he was the inventor of the World War II K ration. That was the Keys ration, 12,000 calories in a little tin box that soldiers could take, into battle. And he did a sabbatical in England, and saw that everybody in England was dying of heart disease. And he went to the Mediterranean. He went to Pioppi, Italy, and he saw that nobody was dying of heart disease. And he decided when he saw the fish and chips that it had to be saturated fat. And so he put together a study, famous study called the 7 Countries Study. Turned out it wasn't the 7 Country Study, it was the 22 Country Study. And he cherry-picked the 7 countries that basically gave him the nicest curve of saturated fat and cardiovascular deaths. And said, see, it's saturated fat. He had correlation, not causation also. So these two, Yudkin and Keyes, duked it out through the 60s and 70s. Who won? Well, clearly, Keyes won. But the question is, why did he win? Did he win because he was right? No. Here's what happened. In 1973, Michael Brown and Joe Goldstein at University of Texas Southwestern discovered a molecule on the surface of liver cells called the LDL receptor. And the reason they discovered it was because they were studying patients who would die at age 18 of heart disease, a disease called familial hypercholesterolemia. So they knew that cholesterol was very high in the blood of these kids who were dying of heart disease. And they figured out it was because they couldn't remove the cholesterol from the blood. They couldn't remove the LDL from the blood because they were missing the receptor. Okay. They then demonstrated that dietary fat raised your LDL level. That's also true. And then other people, epidemiologists, showed that LDL levels in large populations correlated with cardiovascular disease risk, which is also true. So all 3 of those things were true. But the question was, did they make sense together? And the answer was no, they really didn't. But we've strung a narrative together that we thought made sense. And Keyes pushed, vociferously. Basically, if dietary fat is A and LDL is B and heart disease is C, we learned that A led to B and B correlated with C, so A must lead to C. Therefore, no A, no C. Get rid of the dietary fat, lower your LDL, and heart disease will go away. And Yudkin got thrown under the bus. And that was the end of John Yudkin. All of his work and, his reputation, etc., completely thrown into the dustbin of history. Well, turned out that wasn't true. But it took 50 years for us to figure out that it wasn't true. So it is true that A can lead to B, but it could also lead to D, E, F, G, H, and I and never come back to C. And the contrapositive of an argument is not no A, no C. It's really no C, no A. So it didn't even make sense on logistical grounds. But it took the empiric data, and it took the fact that 50 years of trying to get fat out of the diet only making things worse before people started saying, maybe we got this wrong. And so I happened onto the sugar question around 2007. And so I just happened to be in a good position at the time to be able to make the argument that actually sugar was the bad guy and, Yudkin was likely right. And, things have taken off from there.
Let's take that LDL story even further and talk about what we know today about LDL and separating it into the large and small particle and what science is showing when it comes to heart disease and LDL.
Well, it turns out one of the reasons Keyes got this wrong is because there's not one LDL. There's 2. One's called large buoyant, and the other one's called small dense. They are not the same. Now, when you measure LDL, you're measuring both at the same time. The machine can't tell the difference. So your LDL cholesterol is a combination of your large buoyant and your small dense. And it is true that dietary fat raises your large buoyant. But it turns out the large buoyant particle is actually cardiovascularly neutral. It's not the problem. It's not good for you, but it's not bad for you. So dietary fat raises the cardiovascularly neutral species. Small dense is the bad guy. It's so small it gets under the surface of the endothelial cell in the vasculature to start the foam cell formation process, which is what causes the plaques. And in addition, because they're dense, they fall out of laminar flow through the arteries and arterioles, making it much more likely that they will end up causing that plaque. And in addition, because they're smaller, more easily oxidized, and it's oxidized LDL that we've all shown is the inflammatory version. So the small dense are the bad guys. Now, what causes the small dense to go up? Sugar. And it turns out that the small dense LDL is actually the evolutionary product of triglyceride made in the liver that then goes to the fat cell, offloads its lipid into the fat cell, and then what's left is that small dense LDL. So triglyceride turns out to be the bad guy in the story, and triglyceride is made from sugar through this process called de novo lipogenesis. But back in the 1970s, we didn't know any of that. But we know it now. But, unfortunately, you still got the American Heart Association and a whole bunch of other, people, American Diabetes Association, still screaming about LDL. Like, it's the major bad guy. And it turns out, it's a lot more complicated than that. And they're ignoring triglyceride. And it turns out triglyceride, the hazard risk ratio for triglyceride in heart disease is 1.8. Whereas the hazard risk ratio for LDL in heart disease is only 1.3. So triglyceride is 50% more important in terms of heart attack than LDL was, but you don't see anybody argue, even talking about it. So we have a lot of work to do to educate physicians on what's really important. And, that's part of my job.
Well, coming up to the end here, given the addictive nature of sugar, somebody who's tuned into this point and they're like, okay, sugar is a problem for me. I've been adding it to my coffee. I've been having sugary cereal. I'm ready to make the change. Is it smart for somebody to quit cold turkey, or is there an approach that you have when you're working with people to help them get off this drug, basically?
Well, first of all, you have to recognize you're a sugar addict. Anybody who says, oh, I have a horrible sweet tooth, that's sugar addiction until proven otherwise, whether you're obese or not. And there are plenty of thin people who are sugar addicts too. That's number one. Number two, if you are a sugar addict, then you have to treat this like an addiction. Now, there are different ways to do addiction. There's cold turkey. Now, we've done cold turkey, in our clinic, and many, patients have done extraordinarily well. But what you have to recognize is that the withdrawal phase can be upwards of 2 weeks. And it's going to be really, really hard for those people to concentrate during that 2-week period. And so they need their hand held. And since sugar is everywhere and it's ubiquitous, and some of the foods have sugar and you don't even know it, like, how do you avoid it if you don't know it's there? It's one thing to avoid alcohol if you know it's, because you know where it is. But you don't necessarily know where sugar is. So that makes it a little bit harder. All right? Another thing you could do is artificial sweeteners, in an attempt to try to get rid of fructose. Well, it turns out that artificial sweeteners are not a great answer either. And the reason is because artificial sweeteners raise your insulin too. And that's driving chronic metabolic disease. And it's also interfering with leptin, which is extinguishing the reward signal. So artificial sweeteners are probably not the be-all and end-all of this. They're kind of like methadone is to heroin. Okay, better, but not the answer. All right. So, and then, weaning. Well, weaning is a good idea, but how do you wean? Especially when all of the, sugar in your food is fixed. You have to change the food in order to be able to wean properly. So It's definitely hard, and it's not reimbursed by insurance. They don't recognize sugar addiction as a real thing yet. It's one of the things we're trying to do is trying to get it onto the DSM-6. The DSM-5 was in 2013, and it did not list sugar addiction. But the WHO, actually in their ICD-11 codes, there is a place for sugar addiction. So in America, there's no such thing as sugar addiction, whereas around the world there is. So this is another thing we have to fix.
Let's stick on that milk piece, because this is a really important, interesting fact about saturated fat that not a lot of people are talking about. The fact that there's two different kinds, and you mentioned in red meat there's a type that's basically neutral. Within milk or dairy, there's the saturated fat that has possibly even a little bit of a benefit because it's anti-inflammatory.
Potentially, yes.
Is that just in cow dairy? And is there enough of a anti-inflammatory effect in there, in that special property, that it's worth people consuming to get that, or it's just there for,
Yep.
Is there enough to consume dairy is what I'm getting at.
Is there a good reason to drink milk? That's what you're asking. All right. So the answer to that is, I believe the answer to that is yes. Now, this is a little complicated. Milk generates an enormous amount of visceral reaction. So let me unpack it. Let me take it apart for you. There are some people who are intolerant to lactose. Okay, full stop, stay away from it. There are some people who are intolerant to certain milk proteins and develop a, milk protein allergy. Stay away from it, okay? You will know, because if you consume milk and you end up having enormous GI side effects, okay, that's probably a problem, okay? If that's true, what you should try to do is you should try to take some Lactaid, so, lactase as a supplement, and see whether or not you still have it. And if you still do, just stay away from it. That is probably, those two things, lactose intolerance and milk protein allergy, is probably about 20% of the population. So, not insignificant. There are a lot of people. African Americans have a significant increased risk of lactose intolerance. Jews have an increased risk of lactose intolerance. But that can be mitigated by taking lactase by mouth. By the way, I do. That's how I consume dairy, is with Lactaid, okay? Because I'm Jewish. The way it is. Okay, now the rest. What about the rest of us? Is there something in milk that's worthwhile? Number one, there's lots of amino acids, and that's good. Number two, there's lots of fatty acids, including some essential fatty acids. So that's good. Number three, there's a lot of calcium. Now, here's the problem with the calcium story. Everyone says you need calcium. You do. You absolutely do. No question. Calcium for bones, calcium for muscle functioning. Calcium is, calcium for hormone release. Okay, calcium is essential. And milk is a very good source of calcium. So you would say, well, then you should drink milk because of the calcium. And we tell postmenopausal women to drink milk because of the calcium, right? We give them vitamin D too, right? Wrong. This is the mistake. And the reason is not because there's not calcium, there is, but because there's way more phosphorus in milk. In order to absorb calcium, you have to have a calcium phosphate product that is conducive to absorption. And the problem is that the phosphate binds the calcium. So it becomes calcium phosphate or calcium biphosphate or diphosphate and makes it unavailable for absorption. So in other words, in order to absorb calcium, you have to have calcium without phosphate. And that's not milk. That's other foods, but it's not milk. So in fact, the calcium that's in milk is, for the most part, unabsorbable. And that's one of the reasons why giving milk to people with osteoporosis doesn't seem to benefit them. In fact, might even hurt them. Now, can you give calcium pills? Yes, you can give calcium pills, but does that fix osteoporosis? No, that doesn't fix osteoporosis either. And the reason is because the calcium just gets absorbed and goes right through you, does not end up in the bone. You have to do some things to the bone in order to get that calcium into the bone. And unfortunately, vitamin D is not the answer to that. That's why all of these trials of calcium and vitamin D in postmenopausal women have failed. So the notion that you can actually reverse osteoporosis by drinking milk, which is, of course, this, common urban myth that's out there, does not work. As a pediatric endocrinologist, I used to take care of multiple children with hypocalcemia, low serum calcium levels. And these kids are sick. They have the George syndrome or congenital hypoparathyroidism or autoimmune hypoparathyroidism or, host of different diseases leading to hypocalcemia. And we had to boost these kids' serum calcium levels to keep them from having seizures and tetany and, and stopping of the heart and what have you. Okay. This is a big deal. In order to do that, we had to give them calcium and we had to make sure that the calcium was absorbed. So we actually had to take away the milk. We had to take away dairy. We had to give the calcium with no phosphorus. We had to increase the calcium to phosphate product in whatever they were eating to 4-to-1, 4 calciums to 1 phosphorus. Whereas milk is 1-to-2, 1 calcium to 2 phosphoruses. So we actually had to take away the milk and give them calcium without phosphorus. We had to give them calcium supplementation in the form of calcium gluconate or calcium chloride or something else, very specifically to increase the absorption. So this notion that milk is important because it has calcium is actually not correct. In addition, milk does not have vitamin D in it until or unless you irradiate it. So standard store-bought milk will be irradiated, and that's how it has high vitamin D. So you can buy unvitamin D milk, if you buy it from a local farmer or whatever, but that is not a good method for supplementing your vitamin D. So there are all sorts of issues with respect to milk. And then finally, let me address one last myth about milk, and that is that it causes cancer. And this all came from one book, and that book is called The China Study, written by Campbell and Esselstyn. And what they did was they looked at the population of China, and they did an epidemiologic analysis. 500 pages of single univariate correlations, and snapshot in time, no time component in the analysis. And what they came up with was that the consumption of dairy correlated with increased incidence of cancer. And so they said, therefore, milk causes cancer. And they said that casein, the protein in milk, the primary protein in milk, was the bad guy. Number one, this is not how you determine causation. Univariate correlations are not the same as multivariate correlations, and multivariate correlations are not the same as causation. In order to determine this, you would have to have a time component, which they do not have. Okay. And also, there's this thing called reverse causation, where it might be actually people with cancer might have, altered, food intake. And it might also be that there's intermediate causation. Something else is causing both of those things that has nothing to do. Like, for instance, ice cream consumption correlates with drownings. Is it that ice cream causes drownings? Or is it that survivors of drownings, bury their heads in a banana split? Well, neither, okay? Ice cream usually is consumed when it's hot outside. People swim when it's hot outside, and some people who swim drown. Okay, so yes, ice cream consumption is correlated with drownings, having nothing to do with any causation linking those two things directly. Rather, there's an antecedent that leads to both of those separately. That's called an epiphenomenon. So it very well may be that, what they were studying in China was an epiphenomenon, not a primary causative phenomenon. There's no data that suggests that drinking milk increases the risk for cancer.
Let's stick on the China study here for a little bit. That book seems to have a lot of legs and continues to get brought up time and time again. And the reason I want to stick with it, is there any data that they gained from that study that we can use? Or because of the variables that you talked about there and the way it was done, there's only associations made and there's nothing we can really take from it?
There's only association. And, there's a lot of mumbo jumbo in nutrition based on association. And nutrition has been derided by multiple scientists as being basically the dark arts of medicine. And to be honest with you, if you use it wrong, they're right. They're correct. John Ioannidis of Stanford, who is, perhaps the biggest statistical guru, alive today in terms of how to interpret data, basically says we should stop all nutrition research because it's all bullshit. Now, I think that's a little severe, personally.
Although you are trying to kill the word nutrition.
I'm trying to kill the word calorie.
Okay. I thought it was nutrition as well.
No, I'm not trying to kill the word nutrition. I'm trying to put it in its proper place.
Got it.
So actually, let's go there for a minute. I think we've beaten calcium and milk to it, to smithereens here. Let's go there for a minute. There are three words, and they get equated frequently. Three terms, and they're not the same. Those three terms are food science, nutrition, and metabolic health. Now, what is the difference between those three terms?
I know because I've heard you talk about this.
Okay, well, for your audience, food science is what happens to food between the ground and the mouth. Nutrition is what happens to food between the mouth and the cell. Metabolic health is what happens to food inside the cell. So they're all related, but clearly they're not the same. Metabolic health is the only one we really care about. It's metabolic health that drives what we should be doing. Because if something is not metabolically healthy, we shouldn't be doing it, because it means it's killing us. Okay? And in fact, the World Economic Forum appropriately put out a white paper this year, which, by the way, I had something to do with, called The True Purpose of Nutrition. And it turns out the true purpose of nutrition is metabolic health. Now, nutrition can only inform metabolic health. It is not the same as metabolic health. It can inform it, but it's one step divorced from it, because it's only what's in the blood, not what's in the cell. Food science is two steps divorced from metabolic health. And unfortunately, that's the only thing that the food industry is telling you. So ultimately, the science of what goes on inside the cell is what matters. Metabolic health is the true purpose of nutrition. It's the only reason to study nutrition is metabolic health. Well, we have ignored that for 50 years in favor of this thing called nutrition. So it's not that nutrition is useless. It's that it's an adjunct to understanding metabolic health. It's an adjunct to figuring out what gets presented to the cell, so then we can determine what goes on inside the cell. So I'm not saying get rid of nutrition. I'm saying de-emphasize it.
It's not the whole picture.
It's not even remotely close to the whole picture.
You mentioned wanting to leave milk, but you did bring something up there that has a couple little nuances I want to tease out before we fully part ways with it. And that's the calcium supplements. And you mentioned them not being effective. have you heard of them clogging up the blood vessels? I know there was some people talking about that. I don't know how much hard science there was behind it, but for people out there that are taking those, we're learning that they're not effective, but the way I understand it, they can actually be detrimental.
In certain patients, if they don't clear the calcium well, yeah, they could. Now, some people need them. I have to take a calcium supplement at night myself because I get leg spasms in the middle of the night unless I take calcium. And I have been checked for hypoparathyroidism or some metabolic problem, and I don't seem to have one. And when I take a calcium supplement, the leg spasms go away. So I'm treating them symptomatically, and I don't know why I have these, but, I do. And what's interesting is my mother had them. So is it genetic? Is it we eat the same crap? Is it something else? I don't know. I've talked to endocrinologists about it. I don't know if the calcium works. Good. But yes, I have heard that as well. And it depends on how well it's cleared.
Okay. And the other piece that ties into that, the way I understand K2 is it helps the calcium go to where it needs to be in the body and deposit in the right areas.
I'm not aware of that, and you could teach me there. I know about K2, but I've not heard that.
Okay. All right, before we pull out of fats, we're going to zoom back out of milk now and calcium. A couple more little nuances there in that part of the conversation I want to make sure we address. One being the first piece you started with was talking about EPA and DHA and the importance of those. Another one of the 7 was polyunsaturated fats. And the way I understand polyunsaturated, the EPA and DHA fall under that category. Is that true?
No, EPA and DHA are omega-3s.
I thought omega-3s followed under the polyunsaturated.
Well, they are, but they're a very specific kind of polyunsaturated. We keep them separate.
Got it.
Yeah.
I just wanted to tease that nuance out. Okay.
Yeah. No, omega-9s are polyunsaturates. We don't consider omega-3s the same as omega-9s.
And the last piece within fats then before we leave is for somebody that isn't vegan, you mentioned the fact that that can be problematic when it comes to because they're not going to directly be getting any EPA and DHA. They need to convert or they got to go back to the algae source and get that from that.
Well, the conversion is pretty low. It's like less than 1.5%.
Exactly. So, but they can go all the way back to taking an algae oil, the way I understand it, and then get the DHA and EPA that way.
No, not quite.
Okay.
Almost right. But let me correct that, Jesse. Algal oil. Okay. I know a lot about algal oil. Okay. We have researched it in part for this big study we did in Kuwait, which I'm sure we will get to. Algal oil is DHA. Algal oil is DHA. And DHA is important for neuronal structure. No question, no argument. So if you're not getting your DHA from anywhere, then algal oil is a way to get DHA. But algal oil is not a source of EPA. Now, EPA is necessary for neurotransmission. The EPA is the thing that makes fish oil smell like fish. DHA is pretty clean. So it's easy to add DHA to stuff. It's easy to add algal oil to stuff. But EPA is another story because EPA carries that fishy smell along with it. So if you are grinding up salmon livers to get EPA and DHA, you'll get both. Okay, but if you're going to just take the algae and basically develop this clean, colorless, tasteless, odorless algal oil that you basically can add to food, they've had to remove the EPA for that reason. So, in fact, algal oil provides an important source of DHA, but it is not a significant source of EPA for that reason. So that remains a problem.
I didn't realize that. Important information here, because I think a lot of people that are on a plant-based diet or vegan diet assume that if they're taking that supplement, the algal oil, that they're getting everything that somebody would get from a fish oil.
You can get your ALA from your vegetables. You can get your DHA from algal oil. but you're still going to be EPA deficient.
And now that we're on that vegan topic and we know there's this hole within the diet and supplementing, any other concerns for somebody on that diet, things that they're not getting or things that they're getting too much of that are causing problems? And let's relate it to the mitochondria and metabolic health if we can. Use that as our common thread today.
Sure. Well, not so much the metabolic health. I mean, I think mitochondrial health is probably reasonable otherwise, but, obviously you need those omega-3s to make those mitochondria, function at peak efficiency. But there are two things that are low in a vegan diet that are an issue, and they're two amino acids, tryptophan and methionine. So tryptophan is the rarest amino acid, and methionine is the second rarest amino acid. And for the most part, vegetable protein is relatively low in both tryptophan and methionine. And you need both. Tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin, and serotonin is the contentment, happiness neurotransmitter, does a lot of things. And your gut bacteria make serotonin, but they need tryptophan in order to do it. And if they don't have the tryptophan to do it, then you get all sorts of issues in your gut, including gut inflammation and also the lack of carriage of serotonin up the afferent vagus nerve to the brain. And so tryptophan depletion is associated with irritability and depression. And also methionine. And methionine is a primary source of methyl groups. And you need methyl groups because you have to methylate proteins. It's essential. And also because there's sulfur. And the sulfur, so methionine, both methyl and also sulfur. And you need the sulfur as a reducing agent, an antioxidant, in order to prevent oxidation. And so methionine is a primary contributor to S-adenosine methionine, which is necessary to create glutathione. And glutathione is the liver's endogenous antioxidant. So if you're methionine deficient, you're going to be glutathione deficient, in which case your liver is going to have decreased oxidative capacity, which is not good because that's a great way to damage your liver too.
For somebody that's consuming some meat in their diet, is the tryptophan and methionine ever an issue for them, or do they typically get enough?
No, they get plenty.
Okay.
They get plenty.
And then what about the omega-3 piece?
The best place, by the way, for tryptophan and methionine is fish. If I could wave a magic wand, I would basically provide every vegan in the country with the knowledge that if they just ate a little bit of fish to go along with their veganism, they could solve all their nutritional problems.
Which brings me to my next point. Can we get enough omega-3s from fish as somebody who is eating meat? Because that, fish oil is a really popular supplement. It's something I'm currently taking. Can we get enough from food alone?
Well, yes, you can, but you can't get enough from vegan food alone.
No. But the average person that's eating, a mixed diet and having fish periodically, do you feel like, because we've stressed the importance of those omega-3s, do you feel that they're important enough that we should supplement on top of a healthy diet, or we can get enough from the diet alone?
Well, it depends. When you say eating a little bit of fish, what does that mean?
Oh, of course.
Are we talking once a week?
Well, let's talk about what we would need to do.
If you ate fish twice a week, you'd have more than enough. If you eat fish once a week, kind of depends on where you go for your fish. Because if it's farmed fish, no. If it's wild fish, probably yes.
And early in the conversation, when you named off a bunch of different variables when it comes to the mitochondria, we just went heavy into the fat piece. We're going to get to sugar. That's an area that, again, you talk a lot on, and we're going to get there. We have time.
Jesse, we are an hour into this, and that's the first time the word sugar has been mentioned.
Well, this is good because you've done a lot of interviews and you've talked a lot about sugar, and I want to make sure that we don't rush any of this other important knowledge that you have to share. And we can always have a third, fourth conversation and get into sugar if we need to. And we've covered it before. So we're going to get there though. But before we do, let's talk about the radiation piece, because you only address that from going into outer space. So how much of a concern is that for us down here on Earth?
Oh, it's a concern. It's a concern. First of all, our atmosphere is not nearly as good at, catching those, ionizing radiation as it used to be. The whole hole in the ozone layer and all that stuff. Although the ozone layer is improving, but there's also other stuff that causes mitochondrial dysfunction aside from radiation. So obviously, the higher up you live, the more ionizing radiation you're exposed to. So that's an issue. On the other hand, the higher you live, the lower the oxygen tension. And the lower the oxygen tension, that in of itself is an inducer of mitochondrial biogenesis. So you make more mitochondria when you live higher, and you burn energy faster when you live higher. So that's one of the reasons why, for instance, people in Switzerland who eat a German diet have half the incidence of heart disease and diabetes than the people in Germany who eat a German diet. So they eat the same diet, the Swiss and the Germans, but the Swiss have half the diabetes, half the heart disease. And the reason is because they have increased mitochondrial biogenesis. Here in the United States, we have a similar phenomenon because in Colorado, we have the lowest incidence of obesity compared to the rest of the country. If you look at all the maps that the CDC puts out, okay, they always have the lowest incidence of obesity. And the reason that the state of Colorado says they have the lowest incidence of obesity is because they have an outdoor culture. Garbage. The reason they have the lowest incidence of obesity is because they're the highest. They have the highest altitude. Okay, so they have the most mitochondria. And of course, we know this because that's why every football team that goes to Denver to play the Broncos loses in Denver. Because they are acclimated. That's why all of these distance runners train at altitude for just this reason, because it ups their mitochondria. So, it's just junk. This is outdoor culture, my ass.
So the other area you mentioned that are destroying the mitochondria, obesogens, air pollution. What are the biggest areas? Because obviously, this is a big category and a lot we could get into. Let's talk about the top offenders in that area and then things we can do when it comes to air pollution. Somebody who's living in a big city right now, and that's a problem. Like, is getting an air filter in the home enough? Obviously it's not going to be perfect, but
particulate matter, it's called PM 2.5. Particulate matter 2.5, microns. Seems to be particularly pro-inflammatory. And yes, an air filter will help, but you're outside too. What we have seen, there are epidemiologic studies that demonstrate this. Again, snapshot in time. So, you got to take that with a grain of salt. People who live closer to freeways have a much higher incidence of diabetes and heart disease. Now, people who live close to freeways also tend to be lower socioeconomic status, and they have, other potential reasons for why they might have an increased risk of diabetes and heart disease. But these studies factor those in. So complicated, but we think the particulate matter is particularly important. Famous study called the SALIA study, done in Germany. So not in America, that demonstrated this. But of course, people who live close to freeways, usually are low socioeconomic status everywhere.
So bottom line is, I'm trying to kill two words. Okay, I'm just trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. One is calories, and the other is nutrition. Now, nutrition sounds a little bit worse than calories. Like, nutrition matters. Even I majored in nutrition and food science at MIT. Why in the world would I want to get rid of this, term? I'll tell you why. The definition of food science is what happens to food between the ground and the mouth. The definition of nutrition is what happens to food between the mouth and the cell. And metabolic health is what happens inside the cell. And as it turns out, all of the chronic diseases that we are currently dealing with happen inside the cell. So metabolic health is where the action is. And so metabolic health is what we should be talking about. Nutrition, you can do math. You can add up columns of, calories or vitamin A or, amino acids or whatever else. Ultimately, none of that matters. What matters is, number one, what gets absorbed. Number two, what gets metabolized. Number three, what gets partitioned. Number four, what that ultimately does in terms of cellular growth and or burning and or survival. And that is what metabolic health is about. This is where the problem of ultra-processed food comes. All food is inherently good. It's what we do to the food that's not. People refer to food as medicine. That's true if it's food. But you know what? Food can be poison too. Newsweek had a big cover article, Toxic Food. Indeed. So that's where the rubber hits the road. How do you tell the difference between food that's medicine and food that's poison? And you can't learn that on the side of a food label. So ultimately, it's what's been done to the food that matters. And that's what Metabolical is about, and that's what I'm trying to educate the public about.
Well, let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about some of these things that are being done to food to turn it from something that could be healthful to poison.
Okay, let's take something easy. Let's take juice. So, fruit is good, right? Juice is fruit, right? Wrong. That's exactly the problem. And this is an easy one. All right, so why is fruit good and juice bad? What's the difference between the two?
Fiber.
Answer: the fiber. The fiber is the good part of the fruit. The juice is actually the bad part of the fruit. The juice is nature's way of getting you to eat your fiber. Now, why is fiber important? After all, for decades now, we've been taking the fiber and throwing it in the garbage, or we've been smoothieing it so that the fiber ends up being chopped up into little pieces. It basically gets destroyed. It gets macerated so severely it basically is not there. Now, to understand this, you have to understand the science of fiber, and you have to understand the science of absorption. So let's go there. There's not one fiber. There's two. One's called soluble. The other one's called insoluble. So soluble fiber is like pectins or inulin. It's like what holds jelly together. Insoluble is like cellulose, the stringy stuff in celery, or chitins, like the outside of a soft-shell crab. All right. So they're all fiber, but they're obviously very different. Turns out whole fruit has both, has soluble and insoluble, and you need both. So why do you need both? Why does it matter at all? Because when you consume the fruit, the insoluble fiber, the cellulose, will act like a fishnet, will act like a lattice work, and will take up residence on the inside of the intestine, especially the duodenum, right after the stomach. And then the soluble fiber, they're globular. They will plug the holes in that fishnet. And together, with the correct geometry, they will form an impenetrable secondary barrier that will inhibit absorption of glucose, fructose, sucrose, simple starches, certain fats, so that they do not get absorbed early on in the intestine. Therefore, they don't go via the portal vein directly to the liver, overwhelming the liver and causing the liver to become insulin resistant and generate liver fat, which is at the heart of virtually all the chronic diseases that we know of today. The goal is protect the liver. Well, fiber protects the liver because it sets up this gel. Give you another example. You have a spaghetti colander, metal bowl with holes. You run the water. Water runs right through. Okay, now take a blob of petroleum jelly. Throw it into the center of the colander. Now run the water. Still runs right through. Bounces off the jelly. Now take your finger and rub it all the way around the inside of the colander. Now run the water. Water does not run right through. Now you've got a barrier. So, imagine the insoluble fibers, the colander, the soluble fibers, the petroleum jelly, and the geometry of the two together was what your finger did. And now you've turned what basically was a sieve into a barrier. Well, that's what's happening in your intestine when you eat real food. But when you stick it in the smoothie machine, what you've done is the blades of the Vitamix or the Breville or the Magic Bullet or whatever you're using will have sheared that insoluble fiber to smithereens, and so it will not be functional. The molecules will still be there, but the dynamic function of those molecules has now been basically destroyed. All right? So, again, it's what we do to the food that matters. So that's an easy example. But there are many, many other examples. There's, for instance, frying potatoes in oil. Okay, the oil's fine, the potatoes are fine, but once they're fried, they're not fine. Okay, now they're full of acrylamide. Okay, and if acrylamide causes, is a known driver of cancer formation. Okay, an example. All right, how about grilling on the grill? All right, those aryl hydrocarbons are known to cause cancer as well and stimulate enzymes in the liver that ultimately lead to insulin resistance. So it's not necessarily just the food industry that is doing damage to the food. You can do damage to the food at home too if you don't know what you're doing. The bottom line is there's danger in the processing. And whether the food industry does it or you do it, you have to be aware of it in order to be able to live healthfully.
And a big piece of this, you differentiated there, there's processing at home and then processing before you go and buy the food, quote unquote food. But a big piece of it, especially when it comes to processed food that we buy at the grocery store, is sugar.
Indeed.
So let's get into the sugar piece and why this is such a big deal.
So virtually every food that has inherent sugar has an equal amount of requisite fiber. Okay? If you did a scattergram between the sugar content and the fiber content of any given fruit, it would be on a diagonal line. Okay, so the more sugar, the more fiber. A perfect example of that would be sugar cane. It's a friggin' stick. You can't even eat the damn thing. You might be able to chew on it and suck some of the, sucrose out of it, but how much do you think you're going to get out of that? All right. But as soon as you mash it up and, crystallize it and put it in a centrifuge and, now you've got white powdered sugar, now it's a very different thing. All right. And we see this in other things, in other places in nature. Example, coca leaves. Coca leaves are medicinal, but cocaine is a drug. Opium poppies are medicinal, but morphine's a drug. Well, sugar is kind of the same thing. So the bottom line is, the process of purification, i.e. processing, okay, changes the qualities and the properties of various chemicals within food and turns them into something else. Now, sometimes we can harness that for good, like, for instance, 70% alcohol, to sterilize instruments, or, 46% alcohol to pickle your liver, after a, bourbon binge. You decide. So, you have to know what you're doing, and there's science in this story. And the concept of nutrition, that is, adding up what's in the food, is missing the entire point. That's why I want nutrition thrown out, into the garbage. Let's talk metabolic health, because that's what matters. The only reason to even study nutrition is to understand how to make people healthier.
Let's take the sugar piece and get a bit further into the nuance there. And specifically, if we're talking about sucrose or table sugar, and when that is added to processed food, how does our body handle that?
So to understand sugar, first we have to understand what we mean by sugar. Okay, what's the definition of sugar? Because different people have different definitions. So let's talk about that. When I refer to sugar, I am referring to dietary sugar, the sweet stuff. And that could be sucrose, table sugar, cane sugar, beet sugar, the stuff, the crystals you put in your coffee, or high fructose corn syrup, or maple syrup, or honey, or agave. Now, all 5 of those are virtually identical. They come in different formats, but they're identical biochemically. 1 glucose molecule, 1 fructose molecule. Glucose and fructose are not the same. The food industry would have you believe they are the same. They say a calorie is a calorie, a sugar is a sugar. They are not the same. They are not even remotely close to the same. Now, glucose is a 6-membered ring, and fructose is a 5-membered ring. They are metabolized completely differently in the liver and in other cells as well. Glucose is the energy of life. Every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Glucose is so important that if you don't consume it, your body makes it. The Inuit, they had no place to grow a carbohydrate. They had ice. They had whale blubber. All right? They still had a serum glucose level. All right? And the reason was because the liver would take fats, which was high in whale blubber, and proteins, which was high in whale blubber, and it would be able to metabolize the amino acids in the proteins to glucose, or the fats in the whale blubber into glycerol, which then could be reformed in the liver to glucose, a process called gluconeogenesis. All right? So even when you don't consume glucose, your body makes it because glucose is so friggin' important. And if your glucose goes down to 0, you are dead. That's the only time that you don't have a serum glucose level is death. All right? Fructose, on the other hand, this 5-membered ring, is a whole nother ballgame because there is no biochemical reaction in any vertebrate, in any animal cell on the planet that requires fructose for function. It is completely vestigial to all animal life. It is a holdover from our plant ancestors, okay? Because the plants like to store energy as fructose, and the plant can use fructose much more easily. And that's why it's fruit sugar, is because you find it in fruit plants. All right? You don't find fructose in any humans. So the question is, if there's no biochemical reaction that requires it, is it food? The answer is, well, actually, no, it's not food. It's energy. It's energy, but it's not food. So what's the definition of food? The answer is substrate that contributes either to the growth or burning of an organism. That's a fine definition. That comes right out of the dictionary. I got no problem with that definition. Substrate that contributes either to the growth or burning of an organism. Well, it turns out fructose actually inhibits growth. My colleague, Dr. Efrat Monsonigo Ornan at Hebrew University, Jerusalem, has just published 3 articles in Bone Research demonstrating how ultra-processed food, and specifically sugar, inhibits bone formation, bone accretion. It's one of the reasons why fracture rates are going up in the United States. And it actually hijacks normal growth because it increases risk for cancer. In either case, it's not contributing to growth. And burning. Now, people always say, well, sugar's got 4 calories per gram, therefore it contributes to burning. Garbage. Total complete trash. It contributes heat if you are burning it in a bomb calorimeter. That's true. But we are not bomb calorimeters. The way we make energy and harness energy is through a chemical in our cells called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. That is how we capture energy from food and how we power the different processes inside cells. So anything that increases ATP would be food. Turns out fructose actually decreases ATP. It inhibits 3 separate enzymes involved in mitochondrial ATP generation. It inhibits AMP kinase, which is the fuel gauge on the liver cell. It inhibits ACAD-L, which is the first step on the way of taking fatty acids all the way through beta oxidation to make ATP. And lastly, it inhibits carnitine palmitoyl transferase 1, CPT1, which is the enzyme that regenerates carnitine, which is necessary. It's the shuttle mechanism that gets fatty acids into the mitochondria for burning in the first place. The sum total of which means that fructose, i.e. sugar, dietary sugar, actually inhibits burning. So if something inhibits growth and inhibits burning, is it a food? Answer?
No.
So if it's not a food, what is it?
A food-like substance?
Well, it's definitely edible. It's definitely addictive. But is it food?
No.
It's poison. It's poison. And it actually detracts from metabolic health. And we have the data to show how and why. Because fructose drives liver fat generation, and that liver fat causes insulin resistance, and the insulin resistance causes chronic metabolic disease in all your organs. Basically, Alzheimer's is insulin resistance of the brain. Okay, heart disease is insulin resistance of the heart and arteries. Diabetes is insulin resistance of the liver. Polycystic ovarian syndrome is insulin resistance of the ovary, etc., etc. So basically, anything that generates insulin resistance is going to make you sick. Well, that liver fat is what generates the insulin resistance. So that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 with fructose is it causes the aging reaction, known as the Maillard reaction, or the Browning reaction, also known as non-enzymatic glycation. So, to explain this process, it's why we paint barbecue sauce on our ribs before we put them on the grill. All right? It's the cause of cataracts. It's the cause of wrinkles. It is the cause of aging. And turns out glucose does this. In fact, when it does it to a hemoglobin molecule, you get a compound called hemoglobin A1C, and that's what diabetics measure to find out how their glucoses have been fluctuating, right? And the higher that number is, the quicker you die, because the more aging you will have undergone. That's true. Turns out fructose does that reaction 7 times faster than glucose. So it causes that aging reaction even faster. So it's ultimately leading to demise that much sooner. So that's the second problem. And then the third problem is it's addictive. And actually stimulates the reward center in the same way that cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol gambling, pornography, social media, internet gaming do. All right? There's only one reward system. There's only one set of neurons that make dopamine, but there are a whole bunch of different things that stimulate them. But ultimately, everything that stimulates dopamine in the extreme leads to addiction. That's why there's an aholic after every one of those things that I just mentioned. Shopaholic, chocoholic, alcoholic, sexaholic, etc. All right? Well, there's sugarholic too. Because sugar in the extreme is also addictive because it stimulates that reward center.
Okay, let me pause you here and just get a little bit into the weeds. So actually summarize a little bit for myself and for others. So there's 3 different reasons why fructose isn't good. Bad for our metabolic health, ages us quicker, and it's addictive. So when we're talking about this, are we talking about, so just again to go a little bit summary here and higher level, we're talking about sucrose breaking off into glucose and fructose. We're talking about the fructose part of that for these negative reactions.
That's right. So the glucose is not great for you, but it's a walk in the park compared to what fructose does. So glucose can cause the Maillard reaction. All right? You can overwhelm your liver with glucose and still make liver fat, but you have to work at it. I mean, you have to really work at it. Can be done, but it ain't easy. But glucose is not addictive. Right? I mean, glucose is molasses. You don't see people going around chugging molasses, do you? All right? You don't see people chugging Karo syrup, do you? So glucose is not all that sweet. It's sweet, yeah. I mean, yes. All right? Might be good in a molasses cookie. But, in and of itself, it does not stimulate the reward system. It does not stimulate the nucleus accumbens. It does not give you the zing. It's the fructose that gives you the zing.
And again, I'm going to pause you right here because I think we need to explain one thing before we move forward as well. And that we're talking about in an isolated sweetener form here because fruit has fructose in it.
Sure.
But then that comes back to we open the conversation talking about the fiber piece.
Exactly.
That fits into this and changes the whole dynamic there.
Right. So when you consume fruit, it's true you're consuming fructose. I don't argue that, okay? Fructose did pass your lips. Fructose did land on your tongue. Yes, you did generate a sweet signal. Yes, your brain, interpreted that as a sweet signal. The question is, did you absorb it? Did you absorb that fructose? Turns out, because of the fiber in the fruit, you didn't absorb it. It stayed in your intestine because of that gel we talked about. And so it went further down the intestine, and then the intestinal microbiome, the bacteria, chewed it up for its purposes because it loves fructose too. So even though it passed your lips, even though it registered as a calorie, even though it registered as a fructose molecule consumed, ultimately it did not register as a fructose molecule absorbed. And if you didn't absorb it, then guess what? It wasn't metabolized. And if it wasn't metabolized, guess what? You didn't eat it. So even though you ate it, you didn't eat it. Okay? You didn't get it. And so this concept of nutrition that you can total these things up is basically garbage. All right? It's subterfuge. It's the way the food industry basically gets away with putting anything they want in the food or not and making you think that it's fine, and it's not.
We talked about a lot of different sweeteners there when we went into fructose, and it seems, at least in the health and wellness space, certain ones get a pass and certain ones are looked down upon. And things like honey or maple syrup, those are looked at like, okay, that's in a healthy dessert, that's kosher, that's cool. Talk about the continuum and how is there any difference when they get into the body and
right.
start acting within the physiology?
Right. So honey is very complicated. Okay, there's a whole host of people out there that are saying that honey is good for you. Number one, there are no double-blind placebo-controlled trials demonstrating that honey is any different from sucrose. The reason that honey is sweet is sucrose. Okay, but people say, oh, but it's got vitamins and flavonoids and micronutrients, etc. Prove it. Prove it does anything. There's no data that shows it proves anything. Same thing with maple syrup. People say, oh, it's natural. It comes from nature. Yeah, that's true. Okay, but you know what? So does sugarcane. It comes from nature too. Okay, it's what's done to it afterwards. So that in and of itself is not a saving grace in and of itself. All right, and ultimately, the good thing about honey and maple syrup is they're more expensive, so people tend to use less of them. They also have their own flavor profile of their own, and so people tend to use less of them. And anything that causes you to use less of a sweetener, as far as I'm concerned, is a good thing. Now, people say, I am anti-sugar. I am here to tell you, Jesse, right now, and your entire audience, I am for dessert. I am for dessert. For dessert. I am not for dessert for breakfast, lunch, snacks, and dinner. And that's what we have today. Example, breakfast cereal. Breakfast cereal is dessert. If any form of sugar is one of the first three ingredients on the nutrition facts label, that's dessert. And for several of the breakfast cereals that are out there, sugar is the first ingredient on the nutrition facts label. Kellogg's Honey Smacks are 56% sugar. All right? That's dessert. That ain't no cereal. You get the idea. Okay? Ultimately, lots of things are dessert that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Yogurt is dessert. Chinese chicken salad is dessert. All right? And so you have to think of it that way. Ultimately, we have a limit as to how much fructose we can metabolize. Hey, we have a limit as to how much alcohol we can metabolize. We have a limit as to how much branched-chain amino acids we can metabolize. We have a limit on how much various drugs we can metabolize. Our liver, is the detoxification organ. But there is no poison on the planet that, that can't overwhelm your liver's capacity. The dose determines the poison. Now, it just so happens that for sugar, we have a higher inherent capability of metabolizing than, say, we do for cyanide, or we do for VX gas, or we do for arsenic, or we do for cadmium, or we do for benzene, or we do for carbon tetrachloride, or any of the other toxins that are out there in our environment today. So we have a slightly better metabolic profile for fructose than we do the others. But ultimately, there's a limit. And that limit is about 6 teaspoons per day for men. 9 teaspoons per day for men, 6 teaspoons per day for women, and about 3 to 4 teaspoons per day for children, and 0 teaspoons per day for toddlers and infants. That's the American Heart Association who says that. All right? Well, we are quadruple over our dose. So the question is, what does that do to your body? What does that do to your brain? That overdose. And is it just calories or is it specific? And I'm telling you, it's more than just calories because of these three processes: the liver fat, the Maillard or Browning or glycation reaction, and finally the addiction phenomenon.
So just to clarify there, you gave some different numbers for different parts of the population, which would be an acceptable load of sugar for a day. So when we talk about that, that's above and beyond having fruit. That would be like, say there's some honey in a natural granola or a natural yogurt somebody's having.
Right. So obviously there's endogenous fructose in fruit. There's endogenous fructose in various other, components of our diet. But for the most part, those come with inherent fiber, and therefore you're not going to absorb all of that. When we talk about dietary sugar, pretty much the overwhelming majority of the sugar in our diet is added sugar, added by the food industry specifically for its purposes, not for yours, because they know when they add it, you buy more. That's their job. And they've learned over the course of time that there's almost no limit to how high they can go. And so virtually all of our food is overloaded with sugar on purpose because it's addictive. And the food industry's learned that. If they could add cocaine to the food, they'd do that, but they can't. So they found a legal addiction.
Are things getting any better? That's the next question. Like, are there people like you that are exposing what's happening and then changes being made in a positive direction where there's limits on the amount of sugar being added to food-like products?
So there are no limits at the moment, at least not from a USDA or an FDA or congressional standpoint. Right? There are no limits. What is happening is that the public is being educated. And because the public's being educated, people are starting to demand lower sugar products and starting to recognize the problem and toxicity of sugar. I mean, basically, that's what we're doing right now. We're educating the public. And so they are demanding different, and that's good. And some, not all, some companies are recognizing that, reality, and they're doing something about it. Examples. Both Danone and Unilever have in the last 2 years engaged in an exercise to reduce the added sugar in their portfolio by 14%. Now, the question is that good? Answer: better than not, but 14% when we're 4 times overdosed? You think 14%? I mean, that's a drop in the bucket. So if that's what they'll do voluntarily, do you think that's going to make that much difference?
Not enough.
And so this is where we are right now today. I am working with an offshore consumer packaged goods company out of the Middle East currently to completely re-engineer their entire portfolio, 176 items, to reduce the sugar footprint in their products by 78%. 78%. That would bring it down below our limit by far. And so the question is, would that be metabolically healthier? And we're going to do a clinical trial to find out. We think so.
And what about coming right from the top down, going to the USDA and having certain limits put on companies so it's not so isolated and siloed where different companies need to take responsibility or it's got to come from the consumer voting with their dollar? Is there any of that happening?
At the moment, not really. It's still early. We don't see much going on in terms of people voting with their dollars as of yet, but the education is there, and I can prove that that's true. The food industry has a public relations arm called IFIC, International Food Information Council. And in 2011, they asked a question in their yearly report, to the public: what nutrient or what foodstuff causes the most weight gain? And at that time, refined carbohydrate and sugar only accounted for 11% of the respondents. Okay, the overwhelming majority of respondents said a calorie is a calorie or I don't know. They asked the same question again in 2018, 7 years later. And now 1/3 of the respondents said refined carbohydrate and sugar. And the number who said a calorie is a calorie or I don't know went down by the exact same amount. What that's saying is we're teaching the public. Now, will the public demand better? Some people in the public are demanding better. But that has to really be an across-the-board thing. And we're not there yet. It's coming, but it's a slow process. It's basically like, turning an aircraft carrier around.
Now that you're done with Rob, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my episode with Dr. Lee. He's got a lot to share about healthy living. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
So while it's very important to know how to choose the right foods, it's equally important to know what foods we want to be cautious of, wary,